Hello and welcome to another tutorial. In this tutorial we're going to be having a look at some basic unwrapping techniques. We're going to be using Maya 2017 for this particular tutorial, and we're going to be looking at unwrapping these four primitives. Now these four primitives are the most basic shapes that you'll find in any 3D model. Combine them together and you can create some really complicated objects, but for the most part these shapes don't really change a great deal, nor do the techniques used to unwrap them. So let's have a look at unwrapping as a whole. There are four main steps to any unwrapping process. The first step is the selection. Now, in every single unwrap operation we're going to do today, we're going to be using the face selection type. And we're either going to be selecting the whole object, like with the plane, or parts of the object, like with the cylinder and with the cube. Now, the reason the selection is so important is because of step 2. Step 2 deals with projection. Now, projection is the way in which Maya will work out how best to flatten out the object that you have selected, or the faces that you have selected. It does this by looking at the selection, looking at where it starts and finishes, and somewhere along that chain adding a seam. In 2D space it then detaches this seam, which leads on to step number 3, which is relaxing and smoothing. And you will see how this process is kind of carried out in the UV editor. So before I continue, I just want to show you what the UV editor looks like. The UV editor can be found in the top right hand corner of your screen, in here, under the polygons rollout on the right hand side. And the first thing to really notice is that the layout is very similar to Maya's main interface itself. It's very similar. We have a lot of the tools on the right here called the UV Toolkit. A lot of these tools are also duplicated up here. Most of today we're going to be spending in either Modify or in the Tools section. And every UV that we need to pack needs to fit into this box here. Now once the UVs are packed, and they all exist in this box, we then have to do something called a UV snapshot to take those UVs and render them out as a 2D image ready to be painted on and then later applied as a material. I'm just going to close this. So let's have a look at the polygon. Now this plane has got one polygon just because I wanted something really simple that I can show you. Now the first question that I usually get asked by students when we're looking at unwrapping is, how do you know what projection map to use for each object? And the answer to this is quite obvious and quite simple. Some might say too obvious, which is why so many people find unwrapping tough. The projection type that we're going to be using has to match the same shape of the selection. And what I mean by that is, in this particular instance here, with this plane, I have got a selection that exists on one axis. And this is perfect for the planar projection because the planar projection will only look through one axis. Now the cylindrical projection works slightly differently. The cylindrical projection will not look at anything on top or on bottom of an object, but will look at a selection all the way around the middle. And that's why crates and boxes and cylindrical objects will share technique when it comes to unwrapping. We will unwrap these two in exactly the same way. Now you notice there is a spherical option, and in some cases we will use spherical projection to unwrap the spheres, but I find it a little bit easier to unwrap the spheres in two parts using planar, but I'll go over that again, or I'll go over that later on. So firstly, let's have another look at this plane. So we know there are 4 steps: selection, projection, relaxing and packing. So the first step is to select. The second step is project. So I'm going to left click on the planar projection. Now this is going to give me a new item, and it's also going to give me some new options in my attribute editor. The first thing I need to do is sort out this shape, and I can do that by just increasing the projection width and increasing the projection height. This just means that I can see these individual gizmos. Often you won't have a flat plane like that. It will come out roughly the same shape as the selection, but if you do, this is the easiest way of scaling that out. Now we have to deal with the rotation. In this particular instance, it's in the wrong axes. It's looking in the wrong direction. What we want is for this back face here to be facing down. And that's where the rotate options come in here. All I need to do is in this third box, change that to 90 degrees. If for whatever reason this doesn't work, feel free to change some of the other boxes to 90 degrees or change them all to 0. Sometimes it can be a little bit trial and error. Now I've rotated this projection, it's in the right orientation, but you'll notice that the top and the bottom don't quite meet the top and the bottom of the selection. Now in this particular instance it's not going to make a difference because it's a single polygon, but general rule of thumb, what we want is for the projection to be just a little bit bigger than the selection itself. This just means that the unwrap as it appears in the UV editor, which we'll have a look at in a minute, is not going to be too unruly, and also as well there's plenty of room for editing any little small details that you need, certainly if you have to rotate this or have to scale this. In this example we don't have to. So that's my projection. The third step is a relax, and to do this we need the UV editor. So I'm going to open this back up again. Now when we open this, we'll notice that we end up with a red square. This is representative of the plane that we have in here. Now in order to smooth this, I have to come to Tools and I have to click Smooth. But as I do this, you'll notice that nothing happens. And this is because in order to edit the UV, I have to select the UV. Currently I have a polygon selected. Now within the UV editor, there are ways in which we can select the UV. If I hold right click, you'll notice that I have two additional options here, UV shell and UV. Both of these exist in the Maya viewport, but you may not have noticed them. In this instance I'm going to use UV, and I'm just going to drag select those options. And you notice as I do that, I end up with an unfold and relax option here. This is because the smooth tool is persistent, and it will continue to work until I press W and stop it from working. But you'll notice it hasn't changed any of the shapes. And that's because unlike a lot of tools in Maya, this is an actual slide bar. So we have to slide the unfold to a point where we're happy with it. So I'm going to reselect the points here. I'm going to come to Tools, I'm going to come to Smooth, and I'm just going to hold left click on Unfold and drag it to the right. You notice I get a very small change, and once I'm finished I can just press W to collapse that. Now what relaxing is actually doing is it's looking at the size, the shape, the position, the orientation of the selection, and it's trying its best to replicate its position, its scale, its size in 3D in the 2D space. Sometimes this works better than other times. For the most part, the simpler the object, the fewer the polygons, the nicer and easier it is to unwrap. But don't be afraid to tackle more complex objects when you kind of feel confident. Now the final step is in packing. What we're looking when we're UV packing, or we're packing UVs, is we want to fill up as much of this space as possible. Often when you're unwrapping, you'll have multiple objects or multiple unwraps to pack. In this particular instance we've only got one, but what we want to do is try and make up as much use of the space as possible. Any space that we're not using up is essentially wasted. And I'm just going to fine tune the position here. I mentioned earlier that anything outside of this grid will not be rendered, so what we want to do is take up as much space as we can, but at the same time we want to give ourselves a little bit of breathing space either side. Certainly if you're going to be using things like Substance Painter, because when we're baking, which is a process we'll go through later on, we end up with something called pixel bleed. And pixel bleeding can sometimes bleed over into another unwrap. In this particular instance it's not going to do that. But that's it. That's it. It's packed. The final step is to take a UV snapshot of this. This is going to allow us to export that image, put it into Photoshop, and eventually paint a texture on it. Now you'll notice, well you won't notice, but you'll find the UV snapshot in image at the bottom here. If we just left click on it, very simple menu. The top here deals with the file name and the location. The resolution is obviously here, and the image format is here. Once you're happy with all of these options, you just click OK, In my example, it tells me I need to overwrite it. In yours, probably won't. So we can close this and we're done with the plane. Next, let's have a look at these two. These are essentially the same shape and object. The only difference is that the object to the right here we identify as a cylinder, and this we identify as a cube, but they are exactly the same. They have a top selection of faces and a bottom selection of faces, and they have a round selection in the middle. And this lends itself very nicely to cylindrical projection. So I'm going to make now a selection on the box here, and I'm going to use the cylindrical projection. I'm going to come to the UV editor, and you'll notice that I have a nice long list of squares. Now these represent the squares that are selected here, the polys that are represented in the UV in the 3D editor. And that's step 2. Step 3, I need to change to UV. I need to select this particular shape, and I need to come to Tools and Smooth. Again, I need to drag from left to right, and that creates an equalized UV shell for me. Now you might notice sometimes, in this particular instance it hasn't done it, but occasionally when you unwrap these kinds of objects you might find that some of these points are out of place. If that ever happens, the fix is really simple. Certainly if it's a flat object and you want the edges to be straight, all we have to do is select the objects, come to Modify, and we just want to click on Straighten UVs. And that will just make sure that all of the faces and all of the edges are nice and straight. I'm going to leave this out here for now. I'm not going to pack yet because you may remember that we have a top and bottom face that we still need to unwrap. Now I'm hoping you're looking at this and seeing a similarity with the planar that we used over here, this plane here. These are in the same axes. The difference is that the face at the bottom here is facing a different direction than the face on top. But we can unwrap these together. So we can select them and we can apply the planar projection. We have to rotate the projection by 90 degrees, and I will just increase the size of it just to encapsulate the top and the bottom. Now this particular operation provides us a strange problem, and that is that the face at the top is going to be fine, but the face at the bottom is going to be what we call flipped. And this is because of the way that the projection works. If I apply the projection again, rotate it again, and scale it again, this projection is looking down on the top polygon here. The first polygon it sees is facing towards it. This is what we call the front face. It then continues to look through this and then hits this bottom polygon, but with one fundamental difference. It's not actually seeing the front face. It's not seeing the face we're looking at here. It's seeing the face inside. It's seeing the face as it appears here. This is what we call the back face. And we have to sort that out in the UV editor. We have to fix that. Now if we don't fix this, nothing bad happens particularly, but you do end up creating a problem whereby if I apply text to a flip face or a back face that hasn't been sorted out, it's going to appear as if it's mirrored. It's going to appear back to front. But don't worry, this is really, really easy to sort out. The first thing to do is to separate the two polygons as they're currently what we call stacked. And I can do this by holding right click in the UV editor and changing to UV shell. And I'm just going to left click that top polygon and I'm going to drag it to the right. Now we know, based on the direction of the planar projection, that it's going to be this face here that is the back face. But sometimes your objects are going to be more complicated than this, and you might need a way of scanning your UV to see if any of the faces are indeed flipped. Now Maya has a really nice tool that allows us to do this. It's located in the select menu in the top left hand corner here, and it's called back facing, and I'm going to left click this. Now what will happen is the polygon that we identified as being back to front is indeed flipped, and we need to sort this out, and the tool we need, ironically, is called flip. Now this can be found in the modify menu. So I'm going to left click modify and I'm going to come down to flip, and I'm just going to click that, You'll notice that you don't appear to see anything happen, but if I come to select and back facing, you'll notice that now none of these edges or faces are glowing. But we're not done yet. We still need to pack these. Now, depending on the shape, depending on what it is you want to do with that shape from a texture point of view, you might want to stitch these UV shells together. This has several benefits. Firstly, if these borders are together, it means that you don't have to end a texture here if you want it to tile from here all the way over to here and start here. Stitching would mean that we could literally just copy and paste an image all the way through. We could draw from the top to the bottom, we could draw a line going all the way through that, and there would be no seams, there would be no problem. And again, it really just depends on what the object's going to be used for, who's going to be texturing it, and how easy a job they want. Maya has a really nice tool that we can use that allows us to do this. It's called Move and Sew. And we can do this by selecting the destination edge, coming to Move, Modify, and what we want to do is find Move and Sew. Sorry, it's not even Modify anymore, it's in Cut and Sew. If you're using Update 3, you'll notice that the UV editor has had a massive UI overhaul. So in Cut/Sew, we'll notice that we have something called Move and Sew, and if I left click that, it appears up here. Don't worry if it skews this polygon in the middle, because we'll relax this again. I'm going to do the same to the bottom, Cut and Sew, Move and Sew. And then I'm going to change to UV. I'm just going to quickly smooth that again. And there we have it. And that's the unwrap for the crate, or the square. Now you'll notice that this looks very much like a 3D net, and that is in fact what it is. So I'm just going to scale this down, and I'm going to place it in the UV editor. And that's that object unwrapped. So let's now have a look at the cylinder. I'm hoping you can appreciate that it is almost exactly the same shape as the cube, even if it does have a nice smooth outer edge. But let's put this theory to the test. I'm going to go through exactly the same processes in exactly the same order, and we'll end up with something that doesn't quite look like the crate net or the box net, but will look something similar. So I'm going to select all of the outside faces here, and I can do this by clicking, holding shift and double clicking the next edge in the loop or in the ring. I'm then going to use cylindrical. I'm going to come to my UV editor. I'm going to move this off the grid because, as with the cube, I've got the top and the bottom faces there as well. I'm going to change selection type to UV. I'm going to select the cylindrical. I'm going to come to Tools and Smooth. I'm going to drag from left to right. You'll notice very little difference there, very little difference, almost like the plane, it just nudged. And we're going to leave this here. I'm now going to come and have a look at the top and the bottom. Now here's a really cool tip. We can, if we want, select each one of these faces one at a time, but it's actually easier to change to vertex selection mode, select the central vertex on both sides by holding shift and left clicking both vertices. And if I hold control and I right click, you'll notice that these have changed. So rather than edge, UV, UV shell, vertices, etc., it's actually giving me some conversion options. So what I'm looking for is to convert my vertice to a face, and just to a face. And that will select the top and the bottom faces for me. I'm going to select planar projection. I need to rotate it, same as I did the last two times. Are you noticing a pattern yet? I'm going to open up the UV editor, and lo and behold, I end up with the shape here. But as with before, we know that one of these faces is going to be back to front because we've unwrapped them together. I can check which one that is by selecting and clicking back face. It's this one here. So I'm going to give it a good select. I'm going to click Modify, I'm going to click Flip, and we're done. Now, depending on the use for this particular cylinder, you may or may not want to stitch these in place. If you don't want to stitch these in place, and this is pretty much the only time the unwrap differs, I'm just going to minimize this so we can see what's going on in the viewport. if we don't want to stitch these together and relax them, Maya doesn't really have a way of knowing how big these polygons here are in comparison to these polygons here. The general rule of thumb is that the more UV space the polygon takes up, the more detail can be applied to that polygon in Photoshop. What we want to try and avoid is this. Now, although it makes a wonderful face, which I'm sure you're all going to chuckle at, this does present itself a problem. The player, for the most part, is going to be seeing that central section. Of course, they are going to see the top, but any kind of narrative you want to embed in this barrel, maybe it's a quest item and they have to pick up a specific type of oil drum or some such. This could be a battery that they have to select or pick up. We want to put as much detail as we can in this outer face. Now, Maya has a way of applying checkers to these objects, and I'm going to do that now. If I maximize this window, I can click this little button here, and this basically applies a simple checker map to the scene. Now, this might seem pointless at first, but it's a really great way of seeing how much detail we're going to have as a difference here. The smaller the squares, the better. You can imagine these squares as very rudimentary pixels. The more squares you have, the more detail. So hopefully it becomes obvious that we need to make sure that the bulk of the UV space is taken up by the barrel. Where possible, we want to make sure that the squares are roughly the same size, like such. And when I'm in this position, I just want to make sure I can pack these as tightly as possible, giving myself some room for maneuver, because again, as with the crate, I don't want, if I'm going to go into Substance or some other program, I don't want to end up pixel bleeding across into a different object. And that's it. That's it for the crate and the barrel and the plane. Now, these three are really simple to do. The sphere is no different. Sphere is very simple as well. Now, you may have noticed that we have a spherical projection, and this is very useful for spheres. I'm going to show you in fact what that looks like. So I'm going to make my selection. I'm going to double click on here and select everything, and I'm going to click spherical. I'm then going to open up the UV editor. So this itself has created an unwrap. I've kept the checkers on so we can see what's going on here. Now you'll notice as we get to the top here, we end up with some welding, and this is the top vertex here. And you'll see that this creates coning. And coning is when you have a pinch in the UV that isn't relaxed properly, and you end up with what looks like kind of a cone that repeats itself out until we end up in a face that is slightly more relaxed, and so on and so forth. Now I could at this point change to UV, I could smooth, but knowing that I have to do all of that stuff, as well as do any other kind of editing I have to do to make this work, like fix this section over here, it is much easier for me just to use planar. Now what we're looking for is a central line. I've just now selected half of that shape, and what we're going to do is we're going to select the top, and I'm going to click planar, and I'm going to click 90 degrees. I'm then going to come to the UV editor, and you'll notice the difference here. Even without relaxing, I end up for the most part with a pretty good unwrap. I do have some stretching here, but that will be taken care of when we relax. The next step is to select the bottom half, and again I'll use planar. I'll minimize this just for now. I'll use 90 degrees. I'll open up the UV editor, and again I'm just going to edit the size of this projection just so we end up with two similar shapes. I'm going to maximize this now. Now I'm going to select UV. I'm going to select both of these. I'm going to come to Tools, I'm going to select Smooth, and I'm going to unfold them. And you'll notice that one of these has completely disappeared. I'm hoping you can guess why. You guessed it, we have a back face. Okay? Now if I select face and I click select back facing, this is actually back to front for exactly the same reason all the others were back to front. Okay? So again, I just have to select this using face, UV shell, modify, flip, modify, flip. We'll select back faces again. We're fine. I can now select both of these and I can smooth them. Move from left to right. Okay, so this one moved quite a lot, this one didn't. Sometimes that can happen. If it does happen, you can select the other and you can smooth them separately. And there you have it. Okay. And this gives us a pretty decent looking unwrap. You might find that there are some map misalignments here, but if you're going to be using things like Substance Painter, or you're painting an eye, you'll only be using the top half. The back half will be used for veins and guts and God knows what else. And this works quite well for spheres. The last thing, of course, is to pack these in the UV editor, like so. And that pretty much concludes the tutorial on how to unwrap the primitive shapes. I'm hoping you found it useful. I'm going to link a download to this file so you don't have to set it up. You can just open it up and have a go at unwrapping. And I'll see you again soon.